Welcome to another episode of the Holistic Sister Circle. Today we have Lorianna Steele here with us, aka Lolo the Coach. She is a trauma-informed coach and she helps women gain life, confidence, and self-love after a toxic relationship. And y'all, we are about to get into it because we actually haven't dived into this topic. And I'm super excited to talk about it. I'm sure everyone here can literally relate when they've been in quote unquote, a toxic relationship and what that actually looks like. So for us to get started, we actually have some people in the audience as well. If you have questions for Lo, please let us know as we dive into this live stream. Without further ado, Lorianna, can you at least share with us, what does it look like to be in a toxic relationship? How do you even know that you're in one and it's not normal?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. Such a pleasure, such an honor. So there are so there's red flags. That's one thing. But the problem, like you said, how do you know? What happens is a lot of times we get into it and they build on themselves. So it starts out small. We don't notice it. It's like, oh, we give forgiveness, right? And then it kind of builds. But if you find yourself, um, kind of bowing down to whoever it is that you're in, a relationship with, and find that you're walking on eggshells. You're afraid to go to this person or like speak your voice. If you find that when you're around this person, you feel you're having a sense of like you're not safe or you're insecure. Um, so there are some big red flags, like they are controlling you. Like if you're, like, okay, for instance, in my personal situation, there were things like that I didn't know weren't normal in a marriage. Mine is cloaked in spirituality and religion, so that's my personal scope. Was there was a lot of religious oversight, which I thought was normal in terms of head of the household, so you do everything I say, and my word goes, and not being able to have the opinion. Um, and so then you have after effects of just feeling really low self-worth and people pleasing. And I'm sure we'll get into it, but there's things that come afterwards that are an effect of it. But that's kind of a brief, very like, high level overview. There's so much to say about it. That's the thing. It goes so deep. It's hard to talk about it in like, you know.
Yeah, I can totally relate to that. And I do believe that, I mean, of course, your situation was a spousal, but this can be, with parents, this can be with children, this can be with with friendships, with so many different types. Yes, absolutely. And even for me, so one of the things that I had noticed about myself at a very young age was I always wanted to make sure that I was essentially liked in the eyes of whoever I was talking to. So as I think about some of my childhood friends, I had this one friend and she was always the boss. It was like every time we would go out, every time we would do things together, she was the one who was calling all the shots. Yep. She was the one who was making all the decisions. And years and years and years, I put up with it until I couldn't take it anymore. And I just was like, I can't be your friend. So then what I found was it continued to follow me, and it continued to follow me in all different types of relationships, right? Different faces, but the same situation kept happening. And, for me too, I also thought that was normal. I didn't think that it was something that, I could just get rid of, or people aren't supposed to treat you like that or anything of that nature. So for those who are, maybe they don't know that they're in a toxic relationship, maybe they're not sure of what those steps even look like, what would you say? What would you say to someone who may be experiencing that?
Who is experiencing like the negativity, or when they're out? What do you mean?
Is someone who may be experiencing just being in a toxic relationship.
So lots of fighting, usually. There's a lot of like back and forth. When I think of like toxic, think of, you know, anything toxic is poisonous, right? So degrading, typically there's a lot of fighting and back and forth, and there's a lot of tension, but it's the back and the forth, the back and the forth, the back and the forth. One minute you're fighting, the next minute, everything's great. Then you're fighting and everything's great. And there's a cycle. And it typically it isn't always necessarily abusive per se, but a lot of times they are the same. So there's this cycle of, being friends and being great and being really close and everything's, perfect. And then like tension starts to build, right? And it's kind of, that's the walking on eggshells kind of thing. And then there's some kind of fight, there's some kind of explosion, some kind of something that happens, a breakup, or, like if it's, you know, maybe if it's a boss, maybe they write you up for something and there's some kind of, retaliation. There shouldn't be, but it happens. Um, Parents, getting in trouble, whatever. And then quite often after that, there's like a makeup, but a lot of times the makeup is that other person not taking accountability. They might say something like, "Oh, I'm sorry that," or "I'm sorry that you thought that I was being, blah, 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 blah." It's not, "I'm sorry that I did this." It's, "I'm sorry that, you got mad because I, you know, yelled at you." Not because, and I'm not sorry that I yelled at you. I'm sorry that you got mad because I did what I wanted to do. And then, then you kind of return back to the friendship and the cool and everything. It's kind of status quo. And then it just kind of goes in this circle. Um, and not knowing how to get out or not knowing how to get away from it is another thing. Like if you're constantly thinking, okay, I don't feel good, something's not right. That's another thing, is just knowing something's not right. Like that, it's like that intuitive feeling almost, like your spirit is telling you something's not right. And maybe you can't put your finger on it, but that's a red flag. If you are feeling that way and you can't put your finger on it, that alone is one of those red flags. Um, so I would look for that cycle. That would be kind of a telltale sign of that back and the forth, that tension, the explosions, not taking accountability, blaming, gaslighting, blame shifting, so like full out blaming you, but then like you might come to this person and be open with, try to confront them or try to, talk it out or whatever. And by the time you walk away, you've got your tail between your legs and you're feeling shameful and guilty, even though you just went to them to try and talk to them about something that they did. And so that's a blame shift right there. Um, Finding yourself, maybe you were a happy person before, maybe you had your life together, and now it's like you're talking bad to yourself. You're having negative self-talk and you're low self-worth. Um, and if you think back, when did that start? If it started, after all this is happening with that relationship, it could be the relationship. May not be, but it could be. That would be a red flag. Um,
Mm.
those are a couple of things.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you addressing this too, because I mean, I'm just kind of thinking of instances where this has happened to me, and maybe
Mhm.
I didn't think of it as anything that was a big deal, or I didn't put the two and two together, but I'm like, oh, like I've seen instances where this has happened. And sometimes I've seen what you're saying. I've seen things that I've done myself, not
Yeah.
realizing that that's what it was.
Yeah.
And really taking on some of those traits.
Yes, exactly. And another thing that I was thinking, I can't believe I left this out, telltale sign, just the manipulation and the coercion. Those are two, like, they're just very manipulative. And when I say they, I'm referring to someone who is toxic, like a toxic person, might be very manipulative and, coercive, like, which is trying to get somebody to do something that they don't want to do, but using manipulation as a form to get them to do it. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, like you said, you might be doing things that are toxic, but you're not necessarily a toxic person. But the difference is that you recognize it and you are willing to do something about it and make a change. Like you become self-aware. Ooh, like you said, you realized it. Like, ooh, that's probably not what I should have done. Whereas the people who are causing a toxic relationship, um, typically are not going to admit it or be self-aware or want to change it. They might, but a lot of times they don't. Um, and it's great if they do. There can be relationships that, that can be restored if that person will come to a self-awareness and, and work it out. It can happen, but too often it doesn't.
Yeah. Have you seen, and it's so interesting with just some of the clients that you've worked with and some of the things that you've seen as well. I've noticed that men go through this too.
God, yes. There's
And
so much emphasis on women. And I particularly, just because that's my niche, but you are so right. A lot of men get overlooked because there's so much talk about men doing it. But gosh, there's a lot of really toxic women. A lot of them. I don't know. I can name a few.
yeah, and I feel like we kind of, we turn a blind eye to it. We don't necessarily talk about it, and they really don't have an out because they're normally the ones who need to be strong and they need to be able to figure it out on their own. And them just going to someone and saying, "Hey, like my lady is, actually super toxic and I'm in this abusive relationship or whatever it is." People aren't as open to
They're
hearing
not.
those stories
There's
with
a lot of,
men.
yeah, there's a lot of suspicion when that comes up if a man is saying it. Um, and one of those reasons is because let's just go down the rabbit hole of, like, let's say narcissism. Okay. So let's say we're dealing with like a narcissist, and
Oh, wait, before you say
yeah,
that, can you
yes.
just explain what a narcissist is just for people who may not know?
Okay. So a narcissist, a true narcissist, let's put it that way, a full-blown true narcissist, they are very wrapped up in their own ego and their own, um, their status, their image, their they are very controlling, very everything that we just talked about. It is who they are. It's not just behaviors that they might, take up. It is who they are. It, like, the manipulation, the coercion, the abuse, the power and control. That's their MO, is looking, they want MO. So excuse me, they want power and control. Anything that they can do to gain power and control, whatever it takes, that is what they are looking for. So a narcissist is only thinking about themselves. A lot of times they don't have the capacity for love and empathy. So they are all of their conversations, all of their behaviors and decisions are focused on, how is that going to benefit me? You could be in a marriage for, you know, 20 years and this person is still only focused on, how am I going to benefit? And then they often will get very angry, especially if you, like, call them out on it. They One of the things is they're very insecure, and so they project that off onto people. And so their victims or whoever, uh, they get the short end of the stick, because everything that they do is typically about, like, they can be really nice to everybody in the whole world. They're so charming and they got so much charisma, but the person that's closest to them is going to get everything. All of it is going to be unleashed on that person. Or they could be that way for the whole world. But that would be kind of an overview of what a narcissist would be. So we were talking about a woman, right? Okay. So we're talking about a woman, and let's say she's a narcissistic woman, right? Um, or actually, let me back up. Just a narcissist in general. We're talking about men and how they get the blame a lot of the times. So let's say that he's in a relationship with a woman. The man says something, and kind of comes out about it. Well, a lot of times a narcissist says that their ex was crazy, says that their ex was doing everything that they were doing. They tell the world that their ex was doing what they were doing. So if a man is saying this, a lot of times because of the society and the kind of the cultural view that we have, perspective, a lot of times men will be seen as, oh, you're just saying that because you're the narcissist, like, because that's what you're doing, and there's no way that she was doing that. Um, so to your point, that's kind of one of the reasons that they might get overlooked. Um, so yeah, I do absolutely value any resource that could support men that are going through this. Because I do get the short end of the stick on that for sure.
Yeah, and obviously I know that this is the holistic sister circle, but I do think that it's important that we do talk about our men, especially, a lot of us are in relationships and, you just want to make sure that regardless of the situation that you're in, whoever is listening, that if you have a man in your life, whether it's a father, a spouse, a brother, it doesn't matter, and they're going through certain things like this, I think it's really important to address it and just to hear them out, and not give them a, like you were saying, the short end of the stick and make it seem like they're crazy or they're just saying whatever.
Well, and so one of the things that I teach is one of the we focus a lot on the things that come after, like the way that we develop these coping mechanisms. And that's why this is a topic for this podcast, is because what happens to our body. There's a lot of trauma that's involved when you're in toxic relationships, especially repeating toxic relationships. Is something you mentioned a minute ago, as you find yourself kind of following they follow you. And it's because of the coping mechanisms that we develop. And so if, you know, going off of talking about, the men and everything, this applies to everyone, but that might be something that you can look for is, what are they going through? Like, are they showing signs of, trauma or these, and we'll talk about the coping mechanisms, but are they showing, things like the coping mechanisms? And so you can kind of pick up from that maybe they're telling the truth. Um, but always, if anyone ever says that they're being abused, I don't care who they are, or if they're in a toxic relationship, listen. Like, that's just the bottom line. It's just listen, hold space for them. And it's not really your place necessarily to judge, right? I feel like we always get put in that position. Just hold space, listen to them, hold space, and let them talk it out, like you said.
Absolutely. So let's get into, I know you talked a little bit about just the trauma that's stored in the body, the codependency from that. What does that look like?
Oh gosh, that's a heavy one. I'll speak to the codependency first because it kind of leads into the trauma in the body. So codependency is kind of parallel to people pleasing, right? They can kind of be used interchangeably. Um, when someone is codependent or people pleasing, they are there's a lot of fear involved. Fear and insecurity. When I say insecure, like insecure in safety, right? Insecure in losing something or losing someone. Insecurity and fear that someone's going to be mad at them, and then that's going to result in conflict that you can't handle. And so what happens is we have a breakdown in boundaries. And so someone who is people pleasing or codependent, a lot of times the reason is because they are so dependent on this other person to be okay and to be happy and to be, well, so that we can be happy and well. Okay. Because if they're not, then we can't handle it, and we need to do something to fix it. So that's what it looks like. And what's the other part? I lost my place. Okay. And so what happens is we got the no boundaries, and there's low self-worth, a lot of low self-worth. And so then comes the trauma, because we have let someone walk all over us. We have let someone, and when I say let, it's because of these coping mechanisms, right? So someone has walked all over us and maybe taken everything from us, all kinds of different things that happen to lead to trauma. But when trauma is stored in the body, it's going to come out in different ways. And if it's not processed, if it's not dealt with at any point, it'll pop up and show its head whenever it wants to, because you have mind, body, and spirit. There's three parts to us, right? Which is, we call it the soma. And with trauma stored in the body, it shows up in these coping mechanisms. And not being able to honestly handle everyday life sometimes, and this major stress response, because we hold, our body releases cortisol when we're under stress. When we're under constant stress, that cortisol keeps getting pumped out. And so we have kind of a swing between adrenaline, epinephrine, and cortisol when we're in this back and forth all the time. So the body gets completely unbalanced. And with trauma, we have to process that to be able to let the body do what it needs to do and complete the process. Because if we've been in a situation but we haven't been allowed to, for whatever reason, process what just happened, maybe we have to immediately start moving on and, get past it just to survive. Our body is going to store that until we process it. And what that process looks like is completing whatever the body needed to do the first time. So maybe it's talking about it. Maybe it's doing, breath work and letting the body physically let it out, like somatic breath work or somatic healing or yoga or whatever, EMDR. There's all kinds of different ways to let it out, but it has to come to completion for you to be able to heal from that trauma.
Mhm.
Did that
I love
answer
that
your
you
question?
Yes, yes,
Okay.
yes. You answer my question. Now, obviously, you do have a masterclass coming up talking more about this. Can you just share what that looks like with us? And if we would like to join, what does that process look like as well?
I have a webinar, a free webinar, right? So we'll be kind of touching on the different things that we'll be addressing in the actual masterclass, which is a 2-day course that's coming up. And we will be going over, we'll be going over the self-love, well, what everything looks like. Well, that's the first thing we're going to be talking about is everything that you and I just talked about. We go really into depth about those things in the masterclass. And then once we've understood, because one of the things about moving on, one of the things about reclaiming your life and finding yourself and starting over after being in one of these toxic relationships is understanding what happened. Because without understanding what happened, we might tend to, and this happens all the time, is we tend to blame ourselves and think that it was our fault. Think that, we hold it against ourselves and maybe hold a grudge against ourselves because we think that, I should have known better, or, I should have gotten out sooner and all these things. But understanding the processes of what a toxic cycle is, when we have those coping mechanisms that follow us and lead us into those other relationships, and they show up in our everyday life when we're not in a toxic relationship. And so we are still behaving as if we're still in that relationship. And so my goal is to educate on what that looks like, how it happens, how to recover from it, and then how to, once you've broken these cycles, how to then start over in a fresh, new habits, new ways of dealing with things, replacing those toxic cycles with healthy habits, healthy responses. So, for instance, we get triggered, right? That's a trigger is something that evokes those strong emotions that are tied to a memory or a past event. And unless we learn how to replace that, our natural reaction to that trigger, we're going to keep doing it. Time doesn't just make it go away. So my goal is to help learn how to replace that reaction with healthy habits, healthy responses, and moving past. Self-loathing and self-sabotage is a big deal. That's something that comes along with it. So we talk about that. Um, the webinar is going to be kind of a high level overview of what we're going to dive into the course that comes at the end of May. Mindfulness and meditation, that's a huge one too. So we'll talk on that. That's a big part of the program that I have. I have a bigger course coming later. It's not complete yet, but I have a bigger course. It's going to be a 12-week course that's coming later this summer. And it's going to go even deeper. We're going to have more time involved. So,
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for sharing that with us. And
of course.
I will make sure that we add the link to it as well in the description so everyone has an opportunity to check it out.
Thank
And
you.
you're very welcome. And Lo, as we close our session today, is there any words of wisdom or practical steps that you could give our audience before we
Yes,
part
yes,
ways?
absolutely. So I am because it works, I am a huge proponent for just breathing. We take for granted how strong and how beneficial and how healthy just using our breath to overcome situations, everyday situations, anger, triggers, anxiety, panic attacks, fear, using our breath, just taking a deep breath or a couple of deep breaths and dropping, what we call it, dropping out of thinking and dropping into your body, and use the present moment to silence the noise of the anxiety or the memory or whatever. Coming back to present, being mindful, and using your breath to ground and anchor you in that moment is a extremely, like, that is the golden nugget of recovery. Honestly, there you go. You got the golden nugget. But yeah,
I
so
love
I
it.
would
I
say
love it.
use your breath. Do not take for granted the power of your breath.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much. It was such a pleasure having you here, and we've learned so much
Mm.
from you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Queen, thank you so much for tuning in. It truly warms our heart that you're taking the time out of your day to connect with us. If you'd like to connect with our guests further, you can find their information located in the description section of this episode. And if you found this episode helpful, share with another queen. And don't forget to connect with the Holistic Sister Circle on Instagram and Facebook. And until next week, stay blessed. Mwah.